All right, ready to dive in. We're tackling a big one today, the resurrection of Jesus.
Big questions indeed.
And we're not just skimming the surface here.
Definitely not.
We want to understand why this idea, this resurrection, was like dropping a bomb on the ancient world.
It shook things up, no doubt.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we're digging into Tim Keller's The Reason for God.
Always a good choice for tough questions.
For sure. And this chapter, well, it gets right to the heart of it all. You know how we all wrestle with death, search for meaning?
A universal struggle, right?
Totally. Tolstoy even wrote about this in a confession, how facing death's finality can feel like, well, like staring into an abyss.
Heavy stuff.
No kidding. But the resurrection, if it really happened, that offers a completely different perspective. And that's our deep dive today. Why was this such a huge deal back then?
The million-dollar question.
Right. Okay, but before we get into the historical puzzle, we have to start with Keller's own story. Cancer, he stared it down, and it made him confront the resurrection head-on.
Wow. Talk about facing a tough question when it gets real.
Seriously. That experience really pushed him to dig into the evidence, which is what we're doing here. So, let's for a minute entertain the skeptical question. What if the resurrection didn't happen? How does a faith built on this seemingly impossible event even begin?
Right. Good question.
The answer you often hear is, well, people back then were just gullible. They didn't have science like us, right?
Ah, yes. The classic case of chronological snobbery. We do love to think we're smarter than our ancestors just because we have smartphones.
Right. It's like saying they believed in myths, we have Netflix, end of story. But come on, it's not that simple, is it?
Not even close.
So were people in the ancient world really just naive, ready to believe anything?
Not at all. And this is where understanding the historical and cultural context is absolutely essential. Both the Greco-Roman and Jewish worldviews, the idea of a bodily resurrection in the middle of history, it would have been laughable to them.
Okay, so let's unpack these ancient worldviews a bit. First up, the Greco-Roman perspective. Keller talks about how, to them, the body was like, well, a cage for the soul.
Right. Their goal was to escape the physical world, not come back to it.
It's almost funny when you think about it, resurrection, to them would be like escaping prison and then, I don't know, someone drags you right back to your cell.
Exactly. They just didn't think that way at all. Talk about a culture clash. But what about the Jewish worldview? They were big on the physical world being
good.
Right.
Right. But there's a catch. Keller points out that even though they believed in resurrection, it was always something that happened in the future.
Yeah, like a grand finale when God remade everything. A collective event, not a one-man show.
So one person coming back early, totally unheard of.
Unthinkable even, which really throws a wrench into some of the alternative explanations, right?
You mean like the hallucination theory?
Yeah.
Or the whole stolen body idea?
Exactly.
Yeah.
If everyone's primed to think resurrection is impossible, are they really going to see Jesus alive after a tough weekend and jump to that conclusion?
It'd be like, I don't know, trying to bring back shoulder pads in fashion today. Not going to happen.
Ah, perfect analogy. So we have this double whammy. The resurrection was the last thing anyone expected, yet it becomes this foundational belief of Christianity from the very start. It's wild.
So how do we make sense of that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where it gets really interesting, I think. This wasn't some gradual evolution of thought. The belief in the resurrection, it pops up suddenly, fully formed, right after Jesus' death.
You're saying this points to a real experience, not just people sitting around debating philosophy or making stuff up.
Exactly. It had to be something powerful enough to cut through all the existing worldviews that said impossible.
Okay, so we've dug into how the resurrection was like this mind-blowing, impossible idea in the ancient world.
Totally flip the script.
But let's bring this home. Why does any of this matter to us now?
The million-dollar question,
Yeah.
right? What gets me is that Keller doesn't just throw a bunch of arguments at us.
Right.
He asks, even if you're not sure about the resurrection, wouldn't you want it to be true if it meant a world overflowing with justice and hope?
Yeah, it's like he's saying, let's put aside the evidence for a second and just think about what it would mean if this were real.
Right, and that's where N.T. Wright, he's another scholar who's written a ton on this. He puts it really well.
Okay.
He says, without the resurrection, all our efforts to make the world a better place, to fight for justice, it's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a powerful image.
It's about partnering with a God who's not distant, not passive, but actively involved in redeeming and renewing the world.
So it's like without the resurrection, maybe it's all about personal fulfillment, feeling good, but with it, it becomes about something much, much bigger.
Absolutely.
This has been eye-opening, to say the least. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive, here's a final thought for you to chew on. If the resurrection was so radically counterintuitive, so against everything people believed back then,
Right.
what would it have taken to convince those first skeptics, the ones who had every reason to dismiss it? What would make you even consider the possibility?
Good question.
That's what Keller explores, and I gotta say, it's worth wrestling with. Until next time, keep diving deep.